The Koch collection, 4 generations of ring collecting, is the subject of my talk today. This encompasses 120 years and 4 generations. The Koch family, from humble beginnings, became renowned jewelers in Frankfurt am Main and the fashionable spa town of Baden-Baden. Their rise was absolutely meteoric. Robert Koch was the elder brother, and he founded the jewelers in Frankfurt am Main that carried his name, and had been granted the distinction of the court jeweler in 1883 from Princess Maria Amelie of Baden, later Duchess of Hamilton. His younger brother, Louis Koch, joined him in the business. In 1902, the firm moved from a modest shop to the Palazzo Vallot on the fashionable Kaiserstraße. In the memoir of Lela von Meister, Gathered Yesterdays, written in 1907, she describes Koch as the Cartier and Fabergé of Germany. Here you find several pieces of Koch, which I'm showing you for a reason. Koch pieces never had a maker's mark. So if you lose the actual box in which they were sold in, many pieces may have survived, but have not been able to be identified as the boxes are missing. Their clientele was international and included the rich and famous from industry and commerce, as well as the European aristocracy, the imperial families of Germany and Prussia, and also the Russian Tsar Nicholas II, the kings of Italy, Umberto I, Vittorio Emanuele II, and the Prince of Wales, the later King Edward VII of Britain. Here we have a series of tiaras that were made by Koch, and here Princess Cecily of Prussia is wearing one that was with a meander design from 1905. The Prussian tiara, created for the wedding of Princess Victoria Louisa in 1913, has a long history and has survived. We have here Frederica was her daughter, who became Queen of Greece, and her daughter was Sophia of Spain. So the tiara has been handed down to the Spanish royal family and is worn today by Queen Letizia of Spain. The Baden Palmette tiara, made by Koch for Princess Louisa of Prussia before 1881, is now in the ownership of Queen Margaret II of Denmark. Alice and Louis Koch, here's a rare image of them. They collected with a great passion and great knowledge and an eye for rare and beautiful pieces, as you will soon see with the rings. But they also had a collection of Napoleonic memorabilia, and they're well known for their music autographs. In fact, Alice supported her husband and sold an important pearl necklace so that he could buy a German music autograph collection. Here, Louis Koch is shown in a portrait holding a Jewish ring, which is currently in the collection. And we know that the Koch collection, comprised by 1909 1,722 rings. And there's evidence, very few archival material, showing that the rings were also shown in various museums in Germany and also in St. Petersburg, Russia. It is interesting that Louis Koch, a contemporary jeweler of René Lalique, had in his collection a piece by Lalique. We cannot prove it, but it's quite likely that Louis Koch traveled to Paris to see the famous exhibition of 1900, where Lalique was praised as being the modernizer of French jewelry. The combination of glass with gold was quite revolutionary. On the right, you have Paco Durieux, also in the collection from the time of Louis Koch. Durieux was from Bilbao. He moved to Paris and worked in the atelier of Paul Gauguin. He was a sculptor, ceramicist, but also goldsmith. It appears that Louis Koch recognized the change of rings from a hoop and bezel with shoulder to a free art form as we see it in these two rings. As previously mentioned, there were 1,722 rings. They were kept in these magnificent oak showcases that you could stack as well. They have curved glass, and we know today how complicated that is. Remember, these boxes were made before 1904 with brass framework, inside mirrors to give light and sparkle on the rings, and you could pull out the tray with the rings and have them in front of you and handle the rings. When closed, you had a lovely showcase. The rings are mounted on individually carved wooden stands covered with velvet, and there is one at the top to number 42 at the bottom, and you count them as this is 1-1 and this is 142. This was the inventory system before the rings entered the Swiss National Museum and have now barcodes. Here we have box 25 with 18th century rings. Certainly the Koch collection is known for its 18th century rings, and these are a spectacular view. We have here the 50 boxes that were all in a room, stacked up on these almost invisible stands. And we know that these were made by Zehn Schien in Hanau, who also made the etuis for the jewelry for Koch. Prior to 1994, when I first published the collection, the historical part of the collection, there were about 8 rings that were added to the historical collection to follow from René Lalique. And suddenly the fever was caught by the 4th generation, and we had nearly 100 contemporary rings in the publication that came out in 1994. And now we have over 600 rings. This is how they are kept today. They've moved from their original boxes from 1904 into this splendid showcase in the Swiss National Museum with 1,500 rings. All 600 of the contemporary rings are on display, and of the historical collection, some were kept in storage. There were altogether 2,500 rings, so about 1,000 rings are now in storage and also serve as a study collection. Louis Koch, from a talk of his, here's a quote: "Despite its rigidly defined form, the fingering has been subject to an incredible wealth of interpretations. This rings very true in when you begin to see the range of this collection." As you can imagine, it has been an almost impossible task to choose a few rings to show you from 1,500. Let us begin with ancient Egyptian rings. Here is on the top left the goddess Hathor on a bark, and she is symbolic of motherhood, a very important theme within jewelry and rings. The 2 Greek rings here of the Hellenistic period, you have on the top sandals, rather erotic motif. In many cultures, shoes and sandals have an erotic association, whilst the snake, as decorative as it is, was probably worn as an amulet to ward off evil. The next rings are from the Roman period, and you may not realize that the first betrothal rings, as we know it today, began during the Roman period. On the top left, you see the 2 clasped right hands, as you find during the wedding ceremony of clasping the right hands of the couple. And below is the, on this cameo, the inscription Omonoia, meaning concord. The ring on the right is quite explicit. On the red jasper, you find engraved Venus Fortuna, which means luck in love. And the little ring on the lower left side with the cornucopia is wishing the couple prosperity. The Romans loved stones in their jewelry, and through the vast empire, they had also a huge trade. Pearls came from southern India, emeralds from Egypt, and they traded well up to the Far East. And here you have two rings showing this love of Roman stones. And believe me, they also had triple rings, not only double rings. So this is not an invention of today. On top you have the Medusa on an agate cameo, and she was probably worn to ward off evil. The two rings you see here now are from the early medieval period. On the left you have a signet ring with a portrait of the owner of the ring, rather generic as you can see, but his name, Tommaso, is inscribed around it, and you have a cross as a blessing. The ring on the right is from the 8th to 9th century and shows the beginning of the development of enamels as a use for creating color on jewelry. And below, what you can't see here is below the bezel is a tree of life in repoussé gold. So very much it would have had a personal meaning for the wearer. The rings here from the later medieval period are, two of them are love rings. The one on the top, it has a ruby, very much the stone of love, and the inscription inside the hoop in French means, "I'm here instead of my friend." And the ring on the right is English, 15th century, and shows oak leaves, engraved oak leaves are completely around the hoop, which is a symbol of loyalty and constancy. And this is confirmed in the inscription inside the hoop, meaning loyalty. The ring on the lower left has a Roman intaglio with the goddess Fortuna, wishing the wearer fortune and good luck. The name that is inscribed along the bezel is Saint Syracuse. We know the ring was from Italy, and Saint Syracuse was also a Roman martyr. You find in Roman intaglios very often in medieval rings. They were considered as prized possessions. By the late 15th century and from the Renaissance onwards, diamond and ruby rings were used as betrothal rings or wedding rings. And here we have on the left a 17th century example with a table cut diamond symbolizing virtue and constancy, and on the right a ruby ring associated with Venus and love. The ring at the top shows a dog, and inside is an inscription in Latin, "I shall be faithful until death." The ring on the right is a memento mori ring and is worn as a reminder of the transience of life and the inevitability of death. That wearers should lead a virtuous and moral life. Whilst the 18th century rings are rather cheeky and full of love messages, we have here on the top a Cupid in the form of an ape, and the ape was a symbol of lust. He looks into a mirror in a heart-shaped ruby, and inside is a French inscription, "For you undivided, my heart is wholly yours." Now you may wonder why I quote French inscriptions on rings that were either Italian, French, German, whatever country the ring may have been made. French was the diplomatic language and also the language of love. The ring below is a Swiss ring, and we have a swivel mechanism. On top you wear your portrait of your loved one, and below secret is the secret love message. And we have here a Cupid again reaching for a heart in a thorny bush, and the French inscription along the image, says, "After the pain comes pleasure." As I mentioned before, 18th century rings are quite significant in the collection. On top, we have a German ring, rather complicated. On the front, you have the initials, MJC, and JMC is inside. And when you open it, you can swivel the love scene or the initials. You have the initials facing each other and the love scene on the hand, or you hide the love scene with an altar of love, flaming hearts, and doves holding a wreath. Below, you have Love in Life and Death, a French ring of the 1790s, and it's a play of words or letters and words that mean, you've got the letter L, AC, and D, which in French reads as LACD, she renounced. And the ring on the right is English with an urn, and you see a little circular compartment here, and that has hair from the loved one or the deceased. Political rings are certainly something that caught Alice and Louis Koch's attention. On the top, you have a rare ring from the French Revolution with the symbols of liberty and equality and the French tricolor. It is made of copper, and during the Revolution, if you'd worn any jewelry of any sort of silver or with gold and stones, you would have been beheaded, gone to the guillotine. So these were allowed to be worn. They were symbols of the French Revolution and made of non-precious materials. The ring on the top right is interesting. It says Sacré à la Liberté, and you see a cage where a bird has been freed. The stone itself is from the rubble of the Bastille, a fortress in Paris that became a symbol of French Republicans. It was stormed and the royal family was imprisoned in the Bastille. Below you have two rings that are associated with the Napoleonic Wars. 1805, Napoleon meeting Emperor Franz Joseph II of Austria after the Battle of Austerlitz in 1804. And the ring on the right is a rare survival. You have Berlin iron jewelry, but rarely do rings survive. These were rings that were made in Prussia, and it says, "For gold I received iron," and the ladies gave their gold jewelry in lieu of iron for the war effort. Probably the little silver label saying "I gave gold for iron" was probably added later, as the original owner would have only worn the iron ring, and possibly this was added later as a memory of what the ring stood for. Love is always in the air. Here you see three love rings from the 19th century. On top, a ruby-studded rose from 1831. And below the rose is a little capsule with the hair of the beloved. The ring on the left at the bottom has daisies and roses, and with a little, the daisies you can open, like you play with the flower, the actual flower of the daisy. And it says, "I love you little, I love you a lot, or I love you not at all." And the ring on the right, may I remind you that the Renaissance ring, you had the dog as a symbol of loyalty, and here you have the roses. And in fact, the dog is the lid of a little compartment that holds or held the hair of the loved one. In the 19th century, and there are some interesting rings, which I call functional rings. They're not maybe to be worn as a ring, certainly not the water squirt ring on the right. You have with a cylinder, which has a water squirt mechanism inside. You hold it in the palm of your hand and you squeeze the stopper at the bottom, and the water comes out of the ring where the dial is. There's a little hole, and there have been quite embarrassing diplomatic instances with such water squirt rings at a dinner table. The ring on the left has a musical device, and it's like a little clockwork. You press a little button and the figures also move. The lady on the left has a bird organ, and she starts moving and playing the organ whilst the music is playing. And her teacher with the violin, he conducts. A rather charming ring. And below, quite simple, a little perfume flacon with a stopper. It actually opens and closes. So far you've seen rings collected by Alice and Louis Koch, with a few minor additions by the third generation. But in the following, I'll be showing you a selection of 610 rings that are being gathered by the fourth generation, covering the 20th and 21st century. Here you see on the right an Art Nouveau ring from France by Antoine Baudouin, very naturalistic in its style and has full of symbolism. What looks decorative, the honeysuckle, symbolizes devoted affection. Quite different on the left is the Josef Hoffmann ring, showing you a stylized nature, as was typical for the designs coming from the Vienna workshops. Continuing with the Art Deco period, we have rings by Jean Desprez, known for his engine jewelry. He uses traditional silversmithing techniques, which you can see here with the hammer signs, and in a very contemporary style, very geometric, and in the 1930s, quite unusual for its time. Whilst from Jean Vendôme, seen here at the left, is a 1960s ring, and you may understand why it was chosen for the Koch collection, because it breaks all boundaries of hoops, bezels, and shoulders of rings. It's a complete art form in itself. We then move on, and we'll continue by countries and regions, to Scandinavian modernism, which we usually think of rings, jewelry from the 1950s onwards. But this example here from Viva Nielsen from 1939 shows you the inspiration of the Bauhaus and the simplicity of design, which is so typical for Scandinavia. The ring down below by Ray Urban with the rock crystal shows you how the stone just floats in a most unconventional way, and a very simple flat hoop which continues up into a bezel like a piece of sculpture. Whilst Mette Jensen from Denmark, we have a ring made of bent beechwood. Here we're trying to show the younger generations of Scandinavia, but also unusual materials and designs. Tone Vigeland from 1981, the Norwegian jeweler, also known for her art installations or room installations, was inspired by the Norwegian landscape, and very much a modernist of her times. From the United Kingdom, I've chosen two early pieces by David Watkins and his wife, the late Wendy Ramshaw. David Watkins is more known for his large neck pieces, but in the early 70s, he made a few rings, which we're very pleased to have an example in the collection. He made this 4 years after he'd been model maker for the film A Space Odyssey 2001, directed by Stanley Kubrick. The film on the right is from Wendy Ramshaw, a sculpture as well as rings to wear. These she calls her pillar rings, which were inspired by the 1960s urban developments in Britain. From Germany, I've chosen a selection. Reinhold Reiling was influential in the movement of new jewelry in Germany. He was a graphic artist as well as an industrial designer, and he used traditional materials like silver and gold in a very modernist way, or minimalist in this case. And Friedrich Becker, He revived the use of stainless steel in jewelry, and for him the cone was the ornament, like previously the scroll. His forms are very clear lines and geometric. But you see here an optical illusion, because fixed onto the cone is a ball which rotates when the cone rotates. So you have a feeling that it is the actual ball that's rotating around the cone, but it's actually fixed. He loved these playful ideas. He said that people were born to be playful. Gerd Rothmann in his ring at the top, it's a traditional shape for a signet ring, but the unconventional and new idea that he introduces, instead of your heraldry, you have your fingerprint, your personal fingerprint. Peter Bauhuis, at the bottom right, he is the magician of casting. Here the sprues from the casting are used as decoration. He calls it frothy gold. From Italy, you see two examples from the Padua school, Mario Pinton and Francesco Pavan on the left. The Padua school was known for their innovative way of using traditional materials, metals like gold in particular. Mario Pinton engraves his gold like very fine lines, and you have a feeling it's textile rather than gold. Interestingly, he uses a round faceted sapphire in a square setting. Whilst Francesco Pavan rolls out wires and strips of gold, silver, and alpaca and creates this painterly effect on a ring that has an architectural form. Fabrizio Tridenti, on the other hand, makes references to demolition sites and abandoned buildings, and he uses the color, the acrylic, the orange. He calls it also orange building. The acrylic paint gives the jewel-like character to the ring. Bruno Martinazzi uses body parts as metaphors, like here the mouth, for personal concerns, life, and political events. The ring with the mouth is broken in two and cannot even fit together. It was made directly during the period of the First Gulf War, representing the split world, or the world divided. From Switzerland, Max Fröhlich, he was influential in silversmithing and goldsmithing already in the 1940s and 50s. And by the 1970s, he was teaching in Zurich. He also made jewelry from electric wires. He's very well known for his cast pieces of silver. He learned the technique of casting in Africa. Johanna Damm, who was one of his pupils, as was Otto Künzli, she made this ring called gold clay. It's a Japanese invention. Gold clay, when it's fired, it then becomes hard and withstands, so it looks like a very delicate ring, but is quite sturdy. Salome Lipuna knows the technique of urushi, the Japanese lacquer technique, and here the bezel is made of a piece of coconut shell, and with this beautiful urushi lacquer on top, and inserted is a jade stone. From the Netherlands, we have a gold ring made by Robert Smit. It's an amazing drawing in gold in two different fineness, 1,000th and 900. The repetitive ornament is inspired by the Zero movement of the 1950s. And here the gold drawing is rolled to create the ring shape. Lucy Zarnel, we commissioned her to make this ring in her trademark zinc, which for her represents the blue and gray sky and sea, as well as reassuring daily objects like pipes, buckets, and washtubs. Ted Norton is more of a conceptual ring. The title says it all. If you want to be beautiful, you have to suffer, which means you have to hold the ring upright when on the hand, otherwise you lose your jewels. From Austria, I'm showing you two very different types of rings. Fritz Meyerhofer, he lived in London for a while and experienced when the Barbican Center was built with all the steel girders. Here the ring is made of white gold and yellow gold, and the idea behind it is that gold is as strong as the steel girders of the architecture. Ulrich Reithofer made this piece out of this ring out of wood, painted wood. It's carved out of one piece of wood. Now you may ask, why is this a ring? Well, if you look very closely within the table, you'll find a gold wedding band. And if you twist it in the right way, then you can put your finger through it and wear the ring. From Slovakia, I'm showing you a ring by Anton Čepka, which we commissioned for the collection, made of white and silver, which is his trademark. And inspiration was for him aviation and space technology. May I add that also Čepka never made rings, so it was quite unusual for him to accept this commission. Jaroslav Kodaj's quite a different style of ring, with this faceted cone made of silver to be worn over 3 fingers. Both Čepka and Kodaj's were hugely important. They were pioneers of the art jewelry movement under communist rule, which was exceptional as jewelry was deemed non-essential. And if you wanted to obtain silver, you had to apply from the government. Karel Wojtypka is from a younger generation. His ring is made of steel and it's kinetic, as well as the stone formations. He likes to use unconventional shapes of stones, here black coral with Australian opal. From Japan, we have a ring by Katsugo Mitsushima. And before I give you some description, I would like to quote her. Whenever I watch glass being molten, stirring and flowing, as if it's by its own will under extreme heat, turning into luminous orange, I long to freeze this moment of magical transformation. I think she has achieved this. Kimiaki Kagayama, the stone of Kamo River, he was visiting a restoration workshop in Kyoto and seeing how a shrine, a 300-year-old shrine, which was shown always at the Gion Festival annually, he found the chips of this urushi lacquer and decided they were so beautiful that he would reuse them in his jewelry and made the ring. The coral, the Japanese coral, it is inspired by, or it represents the colors of the temple gates in Kyoto, the orange color. Now we travel to Australia. On the left, you have a ring by Mari Funaki, who was originally a painter and was also the founder of the Funaki Gallery in Melbourne, Australia. Her work is summed up by Otto Künzli, and I think it also describes this ring made of white gold. Is it architecture? Is it sculpture? Or three-dimensional cubist calligraphy? The ring on the right by Felicity Peters consists of 52 chairs, and you have the lettering that you see on some of the chairs spells out "Lest we forget." And on top you can see a little boy in white and red, symbolizing the Polish flag, and he is supporting a boy in blue and white who represents an Israeli. The ring is inspired by a memorial on the Ghetto's Hero Square in Krakow, Poland. It consists of 33 chairs made of iron and bronze and is a memorial to the Jewish trials and tribulations that they experienced between 1941 and 43. Finally, we come to the United States with 4 rather diverse ring designs. Top left, Sam Kramer from 1940 with his abstracted surrealist designs. Margaret de Patta from 1947, silver and rock crystal. And here we have a quote from Mahaly Nudge, the artist who inspired her. He said, "Catch the stones in the air, make them float in space, and don't enclose them." In fact, her retrospective exhibition was called Space, Light and Structure, which very much characterizes this ring. The top right, we have a rose quartz ring from Tina Chow. She was a famous model in the 1970s and 80s, and it was the artist Andy Warhol who inspired her to make jewelry. The rose quartz for her had the power of healing emotional wounds. Mystical qualities were important to her in the stones as well as the jewelry that she made. Finally, we have Harold O'Connor with this Eastern architectural type ring, and he uses a Japanese lamination technique on the sail, mokumegane, with various metals, which gives a wood grain appearance. I hope that you've enjoyed this rather brief glimpse of 1,500 rings in the Alice and Louis Koch collection, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak to New York Jewelry Week.